Before I became an Anglican minister, I actually trained as a lawyer, very briefly working as a paralegal in a firm that did a lot of work with churches. So people often ask what the best church governance structure is, and it's something that people spend a lot of time thinking about as they're heading into ministry. Obviously, with all the church failures, moral failures, all sorts of things we read about, we want to know what's the most resilient church governance structure today. So I just wanted to make a little video just talking through what I see as maybe the 5 main church governance structures we see in contemporary Australian and other countries in the world as well. And just have a bit of a think about what the strengths and weaknesses are of those structures. Now, full disclosure, as I said, I'm an Anglican minister, so obviously I'm contractually obliged to say the right answer is Anglican. That's not true. I think actually there's strengths and weaknesses of all the models. I'm very happy to acknowledge the strengths and weaknesses and the weaknesses of the model I work in. I'm probably more acutely aware of on a daily basis. But anyway, questions we need to ask, firstly, where is power distributed? Is it within the local congregation on one end of the spectrum, or is it in some kind of centralized structure, or is it somewhere in between? So think of that as a spectrum from the local to a centralized model. If you think about it in terms of like a retail shop, is it like a local co-op? Is it a franchise, or is it some kind of mega supermarket chain? That's kind of the way to think about it. Now, obviously, there's strengths and weaknesses all the way along that spectrum. Local autonomy is good, and so is broader cooperation and accountability. So there's strengths and weaknesses. The second question to ask is who makes and who reviews decisions? So is it a single person at each level, or is it a group of church members, a small group or a large group? And again, there's strengths and weaknesses on both ends of that spectrum. One person can move very, very quickly, but then again, no one can call them to account. A whole group of people can be arguing about whether to change the color of the carpet until Jesus returns. On the other hand, consensus is good too, and so is accountability. So there's strengths and weaknesses on every kind of end of the spectrum, and that comes, silly decisions like carpet are one thing, but also who appoints ministers, who removes ministers if they do the wrong thing, who holds them to accountable, what happens if there's a breakdown of relationships, who holds them accountable, that kind of thing. And so again, there's a spectrum from a single point of authority through to multiple people in a group. And the third question to ask about any church governance model is what happens when the wheels come off and something goes wrong. So if there's a crisis, if there's a conflict, or if there's just a change of leadership. So it might be a moral failing of a leader, means that there needs to be some kind of review. And that's kind of significant. It might just be that they get old or they die, and so you need to work out what the sustainable succession transition is, particularly moving from a founder of a church, like a charismatic founder, to the next generation is a real kind of crisis point or a testing point. And again, it's a spectrum, so does the authority for making that decision rest within the local authority, or does it arise somewhere outside that local community? So there's different ways of answering that question. So here's the kind of the 5 models as I see them, loosely on a spectrum from centralized to more congregationalist models. The first and perhaps the most centralized model is the Catholic model of congregations accountable to a bishop, and then from that bishop through the nuncio, the kind of ambassador for the Pope, through to the Vatican. So it's a worldwide, very centralized system. The Pope can call a synod, a gathering of bishops, and sometimes congregation members, but really it's an advisory body. It's essentially advising the bishop. So the authority in a diocese, in a kind of regional area of churches, is always the local bishop. And so if that bishop does something wrong, only the Pope through his representatives can investigate that. Now, lots of strengths in the centralized model. Clergy tend to be pretty well disciplined with a clear chain of command. You know who your boss is. Secondly, it's very, very stable. That's why the Catholic Church is sort of still where it is today. Doctrine and practice will be fairly consistent, with some exceptions across the whole world. So they're the strengths of the centralized model. The weaknesses are, well, the model really struggles to deal with corruption in the chain of command, especially when the person responsible for, say, an alleged abuse is the bishop, right? So there's not much that you can do. It's very hard to investigate that. The second problem is there's kind of not as much opportunity for lay involvement. In other words, if you're not ordained as a priest, there's very little involvement of you in the management of the church. You turn up and you can be involved in that kind of sense, but not in the governance sense of involvement. And also as a result, because the Catholic Church doesn't ordain women, you invariably have little kind of scope for women involved in that structure, and which, kind of depending on your theological view, is either a kind of feature or a flaw. In my view, it's not good for men to be alone making decisions. I think God has given us women and men together to make decisions. It's not good for us to have one type of humanity in the room only. So second model, that's the Catholic model, very centralized. Second model is actually weirdly similar to it. I know people find this odd when I say they're actually quite similar, but the megachurch model, particularly the kind of Pentecostal or American megachurch model, has congregations accountable to a senior pastor, right? So if you're a senior pastor over a multi-site church, you're basically a bishop, and it's kind of structurally quite similar to the Catholic system, just they don't normally think of themselves that way. So the model really comes out of American secular corporate governance, where you have you'll have a CEO/president who is both the kind of executive officer running the organization, but also the chair of the board of directors, which is that's a very American way of doing things. It's unusual in other parts of the world. So you see this model particularly where you have churches established by a founder and led by a founder, and where you've not yet had a transition of leadership. And that's a key kind of inflection point. In the megachurch model, power obviously is very highly centralized in that senior pastor/bishop figure, because he also, I say he, it's normally a he, normally leads the executive and also chairs the governing board, which is something which in traditional corporate governance models is quite unusual, quite exclusive to the American system. So what you end up having on the board is executive staff, in other words, people who are paid on the payroll who run the church, and pastors are sitting on the board and sometimes outnumber the non-executive, that is the kind of the people who don't get paid to be there, the non-executive directors. And the other thing is the majority, therefore, are going to be probably appointed and accountable to the senior pastor. So you think of it, you're on the board of governors, board of directors governing the body, and you're meant to be holding the senior pastor to account, but he's also your boss, and if you do something wrong, he can fire you and your family doesn't eat. So there is a very interesting dynamic in that room. Where you have multiple congregations, like sites, sometimes like a multi-site church model or campuses, normally those sites don't have a whole heap of autonomy. They really are accountable directly to the senior pastor. Okay, lots to like about this structure, right? There's lots that you can do. The church with a very centralized power structure and the founder control gets stuff done really quickly. And you have less of the kind of sideways momentum that we can experience in more democratic kind of churches. You can have a clear mission, a kind of distinctive cultural flavor, and you don't get distracted by disagreements all the time. And actually, rather than feel disempowered, a lot of people who go to these churches kind of like that. If they didn't like the direction, they just go to the church down the road, right? And so they kind of vote with their feet, but they like having that clear, attractive kind of founder director. And from the founder's point of view, it's great because there's little risk of them losing control of their church to competing interests and different agendas, and there's you can kind of get on and do things. That said, obviously those strengths are also weaknesses, right? So a governing board which is dominated by executives who are employed and accountable to the senior pastor is basically structurally incapable of providing oversight if the senior pastor does something wrong, or if there's conflict of interest, right? Or if there's different duties or conflict within the organization. It's very, very hard to recover from that kind of thing. It's very difficult to deal with corruption or abuse in the leadership unless it's at a very low level. And it's difficult to achieve a leadership transition to the next generation because it kind of doesn't build up enough of a kind of deep bench of independent leadership to hold the senior pastor account. So that you particularly see this whenever there's a serious moral failing of the senior pastor. It's basically game over for the church. Very rarely do they survive in the same scale, the same form, because its power is so centralized there. And that you can also get abuse going on for a long, long time before it's finally, when it does get discovered, it blows up. The other thing which is potentially a weakness is that there's not much scope for congregational involvement in governance and leadership. It's really quite a tight group of people, and mainly people on the payroll tend to have that kind of power and accountability. So that's the Catholic. Then you've got the kind of megachurch model, quite centralized. The Anglican model I'd kind of rate number 3 here on this spectrum, not in order of preference, just in order of kind of centralization, because the Anglican system has congregations who are accountable to a local bishop plus a synod. I'll explain what those things are in a minute. So the first thing to understand about Anglicans is we divide spiritual and secular or temporal matters down the middle. And we have different accountability for those things. So the spiritual stuff, like the teaching of the Bible and kind of what theology kind of we're going to teach in Sunday school, that kind of thing, pastoral care, all that stuff is handled by the spiritual side of the team, which is led by one minister. Minister can be called something like a vicar or a rector, senior minister, priest in charge. And they're an ordained priest or presbyter, different terms in different places. And they can have a team of staff underneath them, or it can just be one person. But that single individual is theoretically the elder, the singular elder of the congregation. Now, in practice, pastoral responsibility is almost always shared to some degree amongst other ordained clergy or lay leaders. Lay just means not ordained, so just regular punters who are kind of not officially ordained, but might have some kind of pastoral role within the church, whether or not they're on the payroll. So that's the spiritual side. On the temporal side, as in like property and finance and what to do about the leaky church roof and how much we should pay everybody, all that kind of stuff, all the money stuff, all the property stuff is handled by wardens. Now, the wardens are not on the payroll. They are elected by the congregation at an annual meeting. And then a partially elected parish council also provides a consultation body. So you've got the wardens and the parish council. They're the punters. They're the people who turn up the AGM and put their hand up at the wrong time, and then they end up on this volunteer kind of role with authority over the secular matters, the temporal matters of the church. Now, I'd mentioned the annual meeting. That's very broad membership at that meeting. So don't think like Baptist church where you have to kind of do a membership course and sign up and have might have a card that you can show that you're a member. Membership is just broadly communicant baptized attendees. So if you go to the church and nowhere else and you're baptized and you've taken communion semi-regularly, then you can vote at the annual meeting. So it's this kind of very grassroots parish kind of model of democracy. So that's kind of within the church, the secular temporal, so the temporal, the spiritual kind of division. Authority over particularly the spiritual side of stuff, but also over the temporal stuff. Authority over that is accountable outside the local congregation as well. And this is sort of the half-half kind of Anglican compromise. So you have this quite a lot of local autonomy, but then the ministers have to be ordained by a bishop. And that means ordination is generally recognized across different dioceses. So diocese being all the Anglican churches working together in a city normally or a region. Now, depending on the rules, individual congregations get a lot of say in who their next minister is, but they can't ordain a minister, and the minister will need to be licensed by the bishop or the archbishop. Most dioceses have an independent professional standards body who can investigate absolutely everyone, including the bishop, can be investigated for abuse or even bullying, theological matters, whatever. The overall ministry in the diocese, like theological education, mission, schools, youth ministry, that kind of thing, is led by a bishop plus governed by a synod of clergy and lay people. So think of it like a parliament with a prime minister or something. It's led by the bishop, but it's governed by this synod. There might be a standing committee too to kind of exercise authority while the synod isn't meeting. Bishop, which people don't realize, the bishop is elected by the synod or a committee of the synod and usually has a fixed retirement age. So it is quite democratic in that sense, but once you've elected the bishop, there's not a lot you can do until they retire. And each diocese across the world is basically autonomous. There's kind of relationships between them and mutual recognition of ordination, but that's really it. So within Australia, there is a national constitution and some cooperation, but it basically is very much the local diocese is the centre of authority. Lots to love about the Anglican system. There's lots of opportunity for local ministry autonomy. There's plenty of opportunities for consultation between lay and clergy, cooperation and consultation. It's a very resilient system, like it's institutionally built, assuming that there's going to be moral failing at every level. So there's always a backup, there's always a plan B if something goes wrong. And depending on your theology, there is quite a lot of scope for partnership between men and women, even actually in theologically conservative dioceses which don't ordain women. They'll often have, or don't ordain women as priests, they'll often have roles for deacons, female deacons, or female lay people, parish councillors, wardens, synod reps, council members, that kind of thing. So there's lots of different ways that people can serve in different ways. Now, weaknesses. Things just move very slowly. Now, when I say that, Anglicans say that's not a weakness, that's the strength, and that kind of gives you a sense of the priorities here. Yeah, moving slowly can be a good thing for big decisions, but also makes it very hard to deal with massive kind of decisions that kind of gets kicked down the road forever. So depending on your personality type, that's a strength or a weakness. You get little uniformity across the country. So you go to an Anglican church in some parts of the country and it will be unrecognizable from what you may be used to. So it varies hugely from not just diocese to diocese, but parish to parish, even on matters of theology, even on matters of style of worship, that kind of thing. And then maybe the final weakness I'm happy to kind of address is that there's no plurality of leadership enshrined at the local level in the structure. In other words, a good rector or a good vicar will involve others in the ministry, but they can just kind of, there's no structural kind of group of elders which kind of can make them do that. It's really requires a minister who's willing to listen to lay people or employ a team of people. Okay, so we've got the Catholic, we've got the Megachurch, we've got the Anglican. Next, I guess I'd put the Presbyterian model, which is very, very close to the Anglican model. It's congregations accountable, not to a bishop, but to a local group of ministers and elders in that region. So at the local church level, local churches are governed by what they call a session, which is made up of the ministers or teaching elders, plus the elders who are mature church members, who are elected by the members of the congregation. So that's your session, and they are responsible for everything from teaching, preaching, pastoral care, mission within the local congregation. Now, these congregations in the Presbyterian model can belong to various associations which cooperate on mission and forming doctrine, etc. But there's various associations which they can be a part of. Now, what I haven't mentioned is in the local region, we have these things called the presbytery, which is kind of a bit of an accountability for the ministers and the elders in that local church. So basically, you get a minister and an elder from each local church meeting together in a region to form a presbytery, who are responsible for the life and the mission in that area. They do things like ordination when necessary. They do discipline of ministers. Sometimes they can even remove ministers from their position. And then zooming up to the state level, you have a general assembly of each state, which has responsibility for kind of the big picture stuff that individual churches can't do, like charity work, education, etc. So a big kind of feature of this model is the plurality of elders, which I've referred to before, which is the principle that at every level, you don't just have one person, you have multiple people. So at every level, responsibility is shared by a group. You do elect a moderator at those various levels of group, of kind of regional or state-based governance. They are elected for a one-year term, but they're not a bishop. They really are just a chairperson with a casting vote. Sometimes they'll turn up on the news if they need to be a spokesperson, but they're not a bishop. They're really just a chairperson. Okay, so lots to love about the Presbyterian system. It's like the Anglican model, trying to balance local autonomy with some kind of broader safety net or stability or cooperation across congregations. So you get that with the local church, but then also the presbytery, and then the various state-based or national groups. You get plurality of eldership at every level, which means team kind of leadership and accountability is part of the structure. It's baked in right from the start. The local fellowship, which is quite nice, of the presbytery, encourages cooperation and prayer and joint mission across congregations, which is a good thing. Ministers are ordained, appointed and accountable to the regional presbytery rather than their own congregations, which means they can preach kind of boldly without fear that they're going to offend someone and they'll kind of be out of a job. At the same time, the congregation can appeal against their ministers to the presbytery. So there is that kind of balancing of local autonomy and a broader accountability. Weaknesses of the model, when it comes to discipline of ministers or conflicts between ministers, I think Presbyterians can all tell you stories, pardon me, of how really just the local presbytery, small group of ministers from down the road, not well placed normally to handle that discipline of a peer. Essentially, it's quite hard to do that. Another weakness would be maybe change happens even more slowly than in Anglican circles. My Presbyterian friends see that is a good thing, but it's strengths and weaknesses. The high value on local autonomy and interest in doctrine does mean that there's a lot of variations in theology and practice across countries, and there are lots of examples of splits into different Presbyterian denominations for that reason, although we haven't had heaps of that in Australia, to be fair. It is very hard to find opportunities for cooperation between men and women in this model. In every state except, I think, New South Wales, eldership is restricted to men, which theologically, people can debate. But even if you're on the kind of more conservative theological side on that, everyone agrees that it's good that men and women kind of work together. And so it's hard to kind of find an official place for that within the model would be one downside. And just the other thing is elders are ordained for life in this system, which means if you're a little bit ineffective but not immoral, you can stay around forever and just kind of slow everything down and make kind of be a barrier to effective leadership. So that's the Prezi system. Lots to love. Lots to love about all the systems, I should say. The final one to talk about is like your pure Baptist Congregationalist model. So in the typical Congregationalist or Baptist model, the leadership of God over the community is really discerned by that community. The local congregation is key to this model. You can get unions of Baptist churches allowing for cooperation between churches, but really each congregation is totally autonomous. And that means actually that it's hard to generalize about the leadership structure. Some of them will have accreditation or ordination of pastors by a denominational body, but sometimes the local church does ordination itself. The local church will almost always call its own pastors over the teaching and the direction of the church, and then it may also have other officers like elected deacons who do things like the administration of the church, and then elders who are involved in the personal and spiritual care of its members. Now, who are these people accountable to? Well, to the church itself. The church members will often meet to vote on all sorts of issues. So it's a very, very democratic end of the spectrum. Lots to love, high levels of local autonomy. You get robust discussion on almost every issue, and you can have within a church, potential diversity of perspectives for a long time. Lay people, that is non-clergy, non-ordained people, can be very, very, very involved in decision making because of that democratic thing. And then a strength, they would say, my Congregationalist friends would say, a strength would be that doing anything is slow, requiring consensus. Now, a weakness is doing anything is slow, requiring consensus. So it's a strength and a weakness depending on the urgency of the decision and the need for consensus. So some decisions, it is important to get consensus. Some decisions just need to be made, so it can be a strength or a weakness. Another potential weakness is that local autonomy means you end up with a wide variety of leadership structures. Theology can vary hugely within an association of churches, but there's also lots of different associations of Baptist churches, and also some non-association or independent Baptist churches. So it's really a broad field. And the main kind of weakness from a governance point of view is that you end up with no authority really outside the local congregation, which is great until relationships break down. But at that point, if there is if they're stuck and there's a problem that can't be solved or relationships have frayed within a church community, you really have to be willing to reach out and ask for help as a group. In order for, there's no bishop that can be flown in, there's no kind of professional standards who can be flown in, there's no local presbytery, who can come in and help. It's really, you have to be willing to go and ask for help as a congregation. And the pastors can be held to ransom in this system as well by vocal, unaccountable members. So this is the thing, when you have a group dynamic, there can be the people, it can be we're all equal to sharing decision making, but there will be some people who well, they really are the gatekeepers. They're the people who you need to get on board if you want to get anything done, and they're unaccountable, right? That's just kind of a social dynamic often. Okay, so we have those 5 systems. It's all about how centralized the control, and is there one or multiple people at every level, and what happens when something goes wrong. Now, I've called this what's the best church governance model? It's super hard to say, because there are strengths and weaknesses of all the models. And so what we're looking for is something that balances. They're all trying to do the same thing, which is kind of balance getting stuff done with having some kind of accountability and control over that. And it's a tricky problem, and there's problems, good churches and bad churches on all parts of the spectrum, but at least you can kind of understand what what familiar issues you get into in each of those types of churches. Thanks for listening. Have a wonderful day, and I'll catch you around sometime soon.